In this lesson, we're going to learn some more Greek vocabulary, this time focusing on terms for geography. There are several terms in Greek that refer to different bodies of water. One common term is he thalassa, and this is usually translated sea or lake. It can be either salt or fresh water, and this is the term that in the New Testament is often used for the Sea of Galilee, but it can also be used for the Mediterranean Sea, which at times is called he megale thalassa, in other words, the Great Sea. He limne is another term. A limne is much smaller than a thalassa, so we're talking here about perhaps a lake, but a smaller lake, or any pond or even a small pool of water. Potamos, on the other hand, is a moving river or stream. And there's an English word that interestingly borrows potamos, and that is the word hippopotamus, which you may not know is a combination of the Greek words hippos, which means horse, and potamos, which means river. So a hippopotamus is a horse of the river. Finally, we have he Paideia, which means a spring in the sense of a source of water that comes up out of the ground, the sort of thing that we get bottled water from often. Interestingly, he Paideia can also be used as a metaphor for a wound. I guess by analogy with the way a wound can well up with blood, the same way that a Paideia, a spring, wells up out of the ground with water. On the other hand, we have terms for land associated with cultivation and agriculture. The most general term here might be he chora. This just means a district or area or region, and most often he chora means the area of cultivated land that surrounded and would support a polis, a city. Most of the land in the chora would be owned actually by city dwellers, and it was considered beneath the status, beneath the dignity of most elites in the ancient world to be business people or traders, and instead their wealth, what supported their luxurious life of the city, was their estates of land, of agricultural land in the countryside. So this is where that land would lie, in he chora. A related term, tachorion, can mean just a place, but it can also mean an agricultural estate. And interestingly, this is the term that's used for what we often call the Garden of Gethsemane. The term that's used in the New Testament isn't actually a term that means garden specifically. It's the chorion Gethsemane, the estate that's called Gethsemane. Within the chora, we find he kome. In fact, we'll usually find several komai. He kome is a village or a small town, and these villages would usually be inhabited by the tenant farmers working on the estates of the chora. Occasionally, they would also be villages of independent small landowners, but more and more the land in the chora would be bought up by large urban landowners, and these would be villages that in some ways would be similar to 19th century British farming villages where everyone worked for the landlord. These villages were distinguished from a polis in part because they usually lacked defensive walls, where most polis, most cities, would have walls that would defend them from attackers. Ha-agros means a field or any piece of cultivated land, It can also more generally mean the country or the countryside as opposed to the city. The prefix then, agra, when we see it prefixed onto other words, has the sense of wild or rural. But interestingly, it can also have the sense of something being stupid or rude. So we can see that in the ancient world, at least from the standpoint of city dwellers, people in the countryside were viewed as not having very good manners, being unsophisticated and uneducated. And so we have two terms in Greek, ha agroter and ha agrotes, that both mean a rural person or a country dweller. And these terms could have the same kind of connotation that in North America we associate with the word hick. Not just a person who dwells in the country, but a person who dwells in the country and is out of touch with sophisticated, worldly, urban affairs. Hokepos is usually translated garden or park. And it's a garden not in the narrow sense of a vegetable garden, but it's any richly tended agricultural space. It wouldn't usually be used just for a field that was planted with vegetables or grain. It usually wouldn't be used for grazing land, but instead this is land that is often planted with a variety of plants, and it could be a plantation of fruit trees or a vineyard, but could also be a leisure garden, a space that was planted with a variety of plants just to enjoy. A kapos was often enclosed, and this is also the term that's sometimes used for the small ornamental garden that would often be in the center of upper class homes in the cities. Another term that often means orchard or field is togeorgion, and now we're talking about what we would think of as ordinary farm fields or orchard fields. A related term is ha georgos, which means farmer, and usually would refer not to the landowner, but to the person who actually worked the land. This means that since most land was owned by elites in the cities, it can be used to mean a tenant farmer, or a peasant. And Hageorgos is a figure that shows up a lot in Jesus' parables, especially in Matthew and occasionally in Mark, as the tenant of the landowner or the vineyard owner. Georgeo then means I farm, I work the land. It can refer to tilling the land for growing agricultural crops. It can also refer to tending animals. It can also mean I till or I cultivate in the sense of actually performing the activity of tilling a field. There are several geographic terms that are unusual in that they're feminine in gender, but use second declension endings. And if you remember, we usually associate the second declension with either masculine or neuter words. So these are going to take feminine articles, he, tes, etc., but the endings will look as if they're masculine endings. One of these words is he amos. This means sand, but it can also be a beach or shore or sandy land. And interestingly, this is often used for a race course because sand would be brought in to make the race course soft enough for horses and human beings as well to get a good grip when they're running. Another of these feminine words with second declension endings is henesos, which means island. And similarly, hetribos, which means track or trail or path. And finally, Eremos, which means desert or wilderness. And really, Eremos just refers to any uncultivated, uncivilized, wild land. Land that's dangerous because it's outside the sphere of human control and human influence. This is the term that is used for the desert when Jesus goes off into the desert in the Synoptic Gospels to be tempted. And in Judea, Eremos would naturally mean a dry, hot desert, because that's the kind of wild land that surrounded Jerusalem and the other southern Judean cities. This is actually the substantive form of an adjective, eremos, ereme, eremon, which means desolate or isolated. There's another set of unusual nouns here, this time third declension nouns that are neuter in gender and have an epsilon connecting vowel. Now, if you remember, third declension nouns don't usually have a connecting vowel between the stem and the ending. Usually the ending is butted right up against the end of the noun stem. In this case, though, the ending is preceded by an epsilon, and that's going to mean that we end up with some strange ending forms if we're not aware of what's going on. The other thing that confuses us easily about these words is that their nominative singular ends in os. Now, that's the same ending that we see in the nominative masculine singular of second declension nouns. So when we just see a word like oros, which means mountain or a high hill, or meros, which means a part or a share or a portion, when we just see these in the nominative, it's easy for us to think, oh, this is a second declension masculine noun. But we're going to be surprised when we see the genitive form, and instead of oru or meru, we see orus or merus. That's going to be one signal to us that we're not dealing with a masculine second declension noun, but with one of these third declension neuters that use an epsilon connecting vowel. So how do we get that orus ending? Well, we start with the or stem, we add the epsilon connecting vowel, and then onto that we add the ending os, which is actually the standard third declension genitive singular ending. But what happens when an epsilon, the connecting vowel, comes up against the omicron of the os ending? Well, epsilon and omicron often combine to make the diphthong u. And so that's how what begins as or et os in the genitive becomes orus. And what begins as mer et os in the genitive becomes merus. That epsilon connecting vowel becomes more visible in the dative, where instead of just adding an iota on the end of the stem for the dative form, we have epsilon iota. Since epsilon and iota don't usually combine the same way epsilon and omicron do, we can see it there. And so we have the dative forms ore and mere. Since these are neuter nouns, the nominative form is going to be the same as the accusative form. So in the accusative, we don't worry about an epsilon connecting vowel, at least in the accusative singular, and again we just get this form that looks like a second declension nominative singular, oros or meros, and the vocative is the same. In the plural, we're going to have that epsilon connecting vowel showing up in any of the forms here, and so the nominative plural of meros is usually meraa. Now, we've seen before that epsilon and alpha can often combine to make an eta when they're up against each other. And that's what we do see often with the plural nominative of ta oros. The mountains, ta ore, that ending eta is formed by the collapsing together of the epsilon connecting vowel with the standard alpha ending for nominative plurals. But what we'll notice is that with these nouns, the endings in the plural are a little bit unstable. So sometimes you will see orea, and sometimes you'll see ore. Sometimes you'll see merea, the regions or the portions, and sometimes you'll see mere. Just be aware that if you see an eta at the end, what's happening is you've got that epsilon connecting vowel combining with the standard alpha ending for the nominative plural. And if you're remembering that these nouns have that connecting vowel, you won't be confused no matter which of the endings you see. Similarly, in the genitive plural, sometimes that epsilon connecting vowel shows up, and we have oreon or mereon, and sometimes it's left out, kind of swallowed up by that long omega, and we just have oron or meron. The dative, just like in the singular, is the place where we see most obviously this extra epsilon, and so instead of orsi as the dative plural in the mountains, we have oresi. Instead of mersi to the shares, to the portions, or in the regions, we have meresi. And as in the singular, the accusative forms are the same as the nominative forms in the plural. And the vocative is once again identical to the nominative and the accusative. So these are two terms that you'll see a fair amount. Ta oros, meaning mountain or hill, and ta meros, meaning a part, a share, a portion of something, and when it's used geographically, meaning a region or area.